Well, welcome, CityJS 2027. This has been a fantastic conference. Hands clapping for all the speakers and the fantastic organizers. I am thrilled to be back here, and I see so many faces that I recognize from 4 years ago on this very venue stage, 2023. We were all together, and now we're all distributed. Well, I see all of you because you're plugged in with your VR glasses. I personally am presenting from a Caribbean island right now. It's exciting that we're all able to be together in this amazing VR venue. You know, they rendered this entire model in just 6 hours with ChatGPT VR version 19. It was fantastic. So it's really been exciting to see all the booths and everything be able to explore while also sipping on a margarita. This was me back in 2023 on this exact stage giving a talk called A Tale of Two Webs. And I thought that it would actually be really interesting for me to update that talk for the last 4 years that's happened since 2023. So much has changed. In fact, so much has changed that it's hard to fit it all into one talk. By the way, the slides back then, they were fully just two-dimensional slides. If you're using the latest technical preview of Apple Vision OS 3.2, you should be able to see all of these in 3D, but unfortunately, if you're not using that, then you'll just get the 2D experience. It's our best viewed-in tradition of the web. But thank you very much for being here. And so there's so much that has changed about the web, and in fact, so many common themes are still pulling through. So I wanted to revisit the talk before, and my creative name for this talk is Tale of Two Webs Continued. So let's dive in. In some ways, the web is kind of the same as it was back in 2023. We're still arguing about how to do state management and data binding, whether we use hooks or signals. I mean, do you remember how last year we took a term from way back in the 1970s, the word pointers, and we repurposed that to mean variables that get updated magically? It's so much fun. And we're also still arguing about CSS syntax and where we put our CSS. I mean, way back in the day, we had Bootstrap and OOCS and BEM and Atomic CS and styled components. But do you remember even after Tailwind, right after that, they came out with Fluff CSS, and not only 2 weeks later, then they had no Fluff CSS that replaced it. It's exciting times, right? You know, if I had one big regret, still, even today, is that our industry keeps spending so much of our attention and so much of time and talent focusing on improving the developer experience. That's what you've heard all day today at this conference, is how these new amazing products focus on developer experience. And there's this implicit assumption that developer experience, by improving that, it will flow down to improved user experience. I think the shift back from developer experience to focusing on user experience is still one of the most pressing needs, but we've made a lot of progress. So much has changed for the web too. I mean, I was only hinting at those possibilities back in 2023. In that talk 4 years ago, I couldn't have imagined just how much the web would change in such a short period of time. I think the word that comes most to mind for me is acceleration. Everything is coming faster and faster these days, and no, I'm not just talking about new versions of Next.js. As both builders of the web and users of the web, we are here making and experiencing together this completely different relationship between the devices that we use and the users, who, by the way, are humans, and the devices that we use. That relationship has been completely remapped. To the joy or perhaps horror of many, today's veritable digital cornucopia, the web experience, is a swirling maelstrom of AI-generated content, smart contracts on blockchains, 3D virtual worlds filled with, well, frankly, still viral meme dance videos. I don't know why. But all of that is seamlessly bouncing across every screen in our lives, from phones to tablets to watches to reality glasses to TVs. Well, actually, you knew all of that. So what is it that makes all of that work so well? I think one thing that most of us can agree on is that the biggest pivot point for the web is when we pushed and pulled apps and content, kicking and screaming, out of the cloud, way over and beyond the edge, all the way across the wires and the waves, directly and locally onto users' devices. It's when we finally realized, or maybe just admitted, that our best chance to weave the web everywhere into our lives was for all of our devices to communicate directly with each other peer-to-peer. It was to go fully zero server, as it were. but I think I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let's jump back into the past, way back in 2023, and let me remind you of some of the troubles that I felt that we most needed to tackle and start discussing.
So what exactly is it that web's just so broken here in 2023? Well, let's ask ChatGPT to see if it has any ideas. Number one, we have poor performance delivering large apps from the cloud or edge servers all the way to users' devices on each visit. Number two, we have loss of your data when offline or when internet connectivity is unstable. And number three, we have the loss of information privacy. Well, thanks very much, ChatGPT. That's very helpful.
Amazing. That was 4 years ago, and it feels like just the other day. Time really flies. So we had poor re-download experience. We had loss of access to our data when offline or when we had spotty internet. And we had basically no data privacy. Certainly not the only issues that the web has ever faced, but let's admit they're the big ones. We've come a long way. For those 3 worst sins of the web, we've seen this big turnaround. Sure, many were doubters and naysayers, but a lot of us pushed the web forward anyway. And yet, if we too quickly forget the mistakes of the past, I think somebody wise once said that we're destined to repeat them.
Why do web apps have to be re-downloaded on each visit? Why is that the way the web works? Let's see if ChatGPT has anything to share for us. So number one, browser caches are volatile. The larger an app is, the more likely the browser is to purge some or all of the cache resources between visits. We've all probably experienced that before. Applications typically bundle most or all of their resources and code into these single files, these bundles. And even a single change to 1 byte in that bundle requires re-downloading the entire thing. Those are often multiple megabytes in size. You see, your app lives here. It doesn't live on a user's device. Sure, it runs on their phone, but it actually lives here in the cloud many, many thousands of miles away. And that is a really long way for all of those bytes to be retransferred down to users' devices over and over and over again. Many, many thousands of miles of wire. And then, of course, the cell and the Wi-Fi signals as that last mile problem. Even with edge servers, they still might be hundreds or even 1,000 miles away or more. So the more that your app is being transferred down the wire, the more it matters to the user's experience because they are having to re-download many or most or all of those resources over and over again. The greatest lie that we ever told ourselves here in the web is that the web is this zero install experience, which is really kind of an absurd concept because the transfer in the web scenario is effectively an installation. So we really should be asking ourselves, how often do we want to ask our users to reinstall their apps?
I think most people back then thought that edge servers fixed all of these problems. But there's still like 1,000 miles or more from that server all the way down to a phone, and that's frankly just too far away, which leads to more than 1 billion people in the world experiencing on a regular basis too many timeouts. There was probably the hardest thing for us to admit back then, if we're being honest. I mean, there was a lot of huge and popular companies who fully bought into the idea that the web was inherently needed to be delivered on each visit type of experience. You have AWS and GCP and Azure, trillions of 2023 dollars invested, hundreds of thousands of businesses all over the world. And all of them were building their whole web presence right in the middle of the cloud. And you also had hugely successful companies like Vercel going all in on web infrastructure as a service. For decades, the web had just entrenched itself in this client-server model. It was really hard back in 2023 for most people to even imagine a web that did not involve cloud servers. Understandably, a lot of people didn't like hearing that maybe the web needed to move away from the servers and directly onto people's devices. A lot of businesses stood to suffer their competitive advantage if they allowed the web to truly distribute itself. And obviously that wasn't going to happen overnight, so those companies wouldn't give up quietly. Most people just dismissed these ideas as idealist and a pipe dream. They were partly right. The web wasn't going to go through that pivot right away. It took quite a while. But eventually pivot, the web did. The tipping point seemed to rise up later in 2024, several years after Local First began chipping away at the foundations of the entrenched server-full web. I'm just glad that we finally reduced much of the stress in arguing about how to optimize our apps for delivery from server to browser. You know, all that noise about server components and whether we are using server-side rendering or static-side generating, or all the stuff about core web vitals like LCP, CLS, FI8. Who even knew what all those meant? It was all just so confusing and distracting. When we eliminated the repeat trip that the bytes had to take to get rendered onto a device, when we just installed those bytes directly onto the device once, most of that complication just went away. The smart folks who used to spend all of their time and their talent thinking about these problems, they've largely repurposed all of that intellect and intelligence and skill on, frankly, more important problems. That whole serverless thing, do you remember that, like back in 2018 up into about 2023? I think everyone has finally admitted today that it was all bogus. Everyone knew that there were still servers in serverless, and that meant that most of the core problems of the web, they still existed. They didn't go away. They were just somebody else's problem and blame. It was so much better for users when this shift started to happen as well. When businesses started moving the web experiences from browser to server down to locally installed, users didn't even realize that much was changing. But over time, those improvements started to really matter to the users, and it became very clear. Some of the early companies to make the shift were the pioneers. They were bleeding edge adopters. But by the end of 2024, it was not seen as weird anymore. Businesses everywhere, large and small, saw the announcements and the case studies of others that had gone before them making the leap, and they too got excited. The dominoes really started to fall. And now, how great is it that we have instant on experience with virtually every app, including web apps that we experience on our devices? Right? There's no more spinners. The same way that all the other apps have always been. We used to, do you remember when we used to get excited about like a 500 millisecond cold start? And now we have 0 millisecond. But that wasn't the only big problem that the web needed to solve back then.
Does a lack of reliable internet connection imply that it causes me to lose access to my data from a web app? ChatGPT, again, can be helpful here. You see, first, even if a web app successfully is able to preserve its code and its resources on your device, your data is usually only stored way out in the cloud. And this is typically touted as a convenience for you to keep your data backed up and in sync and keep it available, synced across all of your devices. But if you have no connection or you have an unreliable connection to the cloud, well, you cannot access your data. How many of you have seen this icon? I certainly see this all the time while I'm traveling. Because no connection to the cloud, or even an unreliable connection to the cloud, makes you effectively data-less. So I think the question that we should be asking is, why aren't we storing it in both places? Well, unfortunately, there are issues. So what does ChatGPT have to say about why we can't just store data in both places? Well, number one, despite many years of efforts to evangelize the offline-first methodology, most of the web apps out there, and the businesses who build them, quite frankly, unfortunately, they don't seem to care. They have your data, and that's how they make money. More recently, this local-first web movement, more on that in just a moment, has been gaining steam and spreading the mission that data should first and foremost be stored locally and then optionally stored remotely out in the cloud. This local-first web development group is an extremely exciting group, and I highly encourage all of you to come and join. The movers and the shakers, the forward thinkers in this space, many of the people who founded the ideas behind local-first development are part of this community.
Local first might have sounded like this niche idea back in 2023, but we all know that here in 2027, that is one of the most pivotal inflection points in the history of the web. Let's revisit a few key tweets, or I guess maybe they're like X's or Zeets, or I don't even know how we pronounce those now, but from back in 2023 that signaled and summed up the mission of local first web dev. We've come to think of the cloud as a convenient way to store information. But what happens when there's a problem with the server or internet connection? Suddenly, we're unable to access our own data. We've become so reliant on the cloud, this loss can be debilitating. This is especially true for businesses or systems that rely on it. Local first data storage, on the other hand, solves this problem. With local first data, users can access and work with their data even when they're offline, without relying on an internet connection. This allows for greater flexibility and productivity, especially for users who work in remote areas with limited connectivity. Since data is stored and processed locally, applications that use local first data can be faster and more responsive than those that rely on those remote servers. Users also have more control over their data rather than entrusting it to these remote servers that may be vulnerable to hacking or other security threats. I think it's important to point out, by the way, that local first apps are just web apps built with whatever web tech framework you like. You use frameworks, or like me, maybe you don't use frameworks at all. That's mostly true, but not entirely. I think I'll be a bit concerned about using React to build local first apps if React sees React server components as the default React. Yeah, that was a bit of a disturbing trend, I think. See, React grew not to, you remember back in the day they used to be just a front-end library? They weren't even a framework, and then they became a framework, and I think arguably by this point they're just a platform, which brings with it all of the inherent server complexity. And I think most of us can agree now that that was the opposite of what we should be doing. Thankfully, the let's move back to the server trend was mostly hype and short-lived. So Local First has been advocating as a primary foundational principle that we need to be storing users' data that they should own and control first and foremost on their devices. But web apps storing data on devices has always been troublesome, at least up to that point, with all sorts of issues from like 5 megabyte limits to purging data randomly. Here's how I summarized those issues back in 2023.
Why then can't we just store all of this data on our devices and again also out in the cloud? Unfortunately, the web platform has had historically some problems, and we talked about a little bit about this earlier in the talk. We have local storage, we even have things like IndexedDB, but unfortunately these are very unreliable. And many of these storage mechanisms that we can use in the browser, they might just decide to evict that data. Now, if it was like temporary data, like a shopping cart or something like that, that's not a big deal. But because we also want to be able to store really important user information in the browser, this is a big problem if we're trying to rely on these very unreliable mediums. Also, they're size limited. Most of them are limited to like 5 megabytes. Now, thankfully, there has been some progress on this topic. Somewhat recently, we've seen some movement in a file system API that's actually been in the process and gone through various revisions for almost like 5 or 6 years, a long time. But it's most recently kind of stabilized, and it's in Firefox and it's in Chromium. Unfortunately, this API has not, there's no signal yet. It has not landed in WebKit and iOS, and so I think you and I both know that means we might be waiting a little while for that.
Spoiler alert, we're still waiting. You see, progressive web apps, PWAs, were the primary way that the web tried to expand its capabilities, like the file system API, to have more parity with full native apps. PWAs are literally just normal web apps that, along with being built on top of a service worker, can actually be installed to a device and act mostly like a real app.
Speaking of PWA, don't these service workers inside of progressive web apps, don't they give us more control over the caching and the reloading behavior of these resources and our data? It is true, and in fact, one of the main advantages of service workers is that they do give us fine-grained control over the loading and the caching of those resources. However, most of the authors that use these, they neglect these capabilities. In fact, there are actually additional capabilities that are really untapped and really should be used. For example, periodic background sync is one of my favorite APIs that almost nobody uses, nobody knows about. It allows a web app to update itself periodically in the background, even if the user doesn't have the web app open, so that a user always has fresh, latest resources loaded, and they have a quick, almost instantaneous app launch. As of early 2023, unfortunately, this API is only available in Chrome. But the thing about the service worker is that it reorients the entire relationship of a web application. The whole architecture it reorients and really kind of takes most of the important parts of the back end and puts them directly into the front end, co-located with that front end code.
Even the most non-technical of users understood back then how ephemeral and unreliable the web experience was. You would open up a website, start reading, clicking around on things to explore, and then you'd go get on a bus or a train or a plane and look back down at your phone, and the content and experience that you had before was now gone. It was dead. You couldn't even scroll through the content that had already loaded because the browser had, for some reason, discarded the background tab and forced a reload when you switched back. Users really, really hated this. They never understood why real apps kept working, but the web could just stop working. Maybe more than any other sin of the web, this was the thing that kept the web as a second-class citizen in users' minds. It's so much more beautiful and graceful of an experience now, isn't it? The web doesn't go away when our internet connections falter. Most of the web applications that we see that are popular and that are widespread use these days, they've all embraced that offline first, that local first mindset. They're all more or less preserving our data locally on our devices so that we always have access to our data no matter what our internet connection looks like. This has made a huge difference, honestly. Turns out users really do care about always having our data immediately at hand. Of the top 50 apps that are downloaded on the major mobile platforms now, almost half of them are local first web apps. That's huge. Before 2023, there had been just a handful of experiments into making local first applications that could scale up to these huge user bases, and they were led by forward-thinking companies like InKnSwitch. But today, there are hundreds of thousands of businesses and content creators who are delivering these local first installed web experiences. The latest market research suggests that these experiences are now reaching more than 500 million active users every day. That's a huge chunk of the world that is embraced what the web could be. I'm super proud to have been just a tiny little part of this big movement that has reshaped the web over the last few years. I want us to revisit what I said about my employer Socket Supply back then and how they would champion this effort.
Talk to you a bit about Socket Supply Company. I joined as a senior tech leader with this company back at the beginning of this year of 2023. And I want to talk to you about what I think that they're really doing that I think is pushing this space forward, and it's why I'm so excited to be working there. Socket Supply builds a free open source framework. It's a runtime, and it allows you to take a web application and package it as a native app, what we so-called hybrid app runtimes. And you've probably heard of things like, React Native and Towery, and even way, way back in the day, like PhoneGap and Cordova. It's kind of in that same general space. What it does is it takes a web view, it instantiates your web code inside of a web view, and so you can use all of the normal web frameworks and code the way that you like, or no framework at all if you roll like me. However you want to do it, whatever your web code is, you shouldn't have to change it because it runs inside of a web view. But our runtime wrapped around it adds very important additional capabilities to the web application that you normally don't get from the web APIs. For example, we namely have a full file system API, so we don't have to wait around on browsers to do that. We have full networking capability and full Bluetooth, and we have a few others that are hopefully coming along as well. But these native APIs are injected into your web scope, the scope of your web application, so you can access them much like Node.js web APIs, and you can use those in your applications. So you have full capability like you would in a native app, but you can keep writing all of your favorite web code. I think this is a really compelling story for businesses who have invested heavily in teams that are specialized in web development. Why ask them to go and relearn something like, learn a whole new language like Rust, for example? That's what Towery does. They say that they want you to write your backend or your main process in Rust. We don't think that that makes sense for web developers. And honestly, I think of this as sort of the next step from progressive web apps. So it's really like we're taking the P from progressive web app and changing it into packaged web apps. That's really what this is. And I want to say that it's not just an option, like similar to Electron and Towery. Yes, we are in that similar space, but it's not just another version of those things. Because we do offer some truly groundbreaking capabilities that you really probably can't do in those. And I want to talk a moment about a few of those. First and foremost, one of the things that we're most excited about is that because we have a full networking stack, we can actually do true zero-server peer-to-peer. That means that apps can talk directly to each other without having any server middleman whatsoever. What that means is you can literally build almost any application that you normally build with some cloud backend. You can put that logic into each of the app installs, each of the app instances on your users' devices, and basically say goodbye to all of the cloud services that are creating all the complexity and often huge costs and overhead for your business. You can just simply have their apps talking directly to each other, exchanging data as they need to. What we think is that if you do not have to pay so much for the cloud, it's going to drastically reduce the cost to running businesses and running these kinds of apps. That's going to allow significantly more apps to be able to be created that may not be able to be doing so right now because of the unfeasible cost of scaling in the cloud. That's one of the great things about peer-to-peer, by the way. When you're scaling in the cloud, the more users and the more data you add, the more cost there is and the more difficult it is to get the complex system working. But in a peer-to-peer, it actually works inversely, because the more users you get, the more data that's being transmitted around, actually the cheaper and more reliable and more stable that network becomes. And that's one of the things that I think we're most excited about.
2023 was when Socket emerged to embrace the promises of the local first movement, the idea that these apps should be built to default to storing user data locally on the device rather than defaulting to storing it out in the cloud. And along with many other great projects in the local first space, Socket Supply bolstered these efforts to bring those local first app capabilities to the masses and to the web. To break free from the ransom tyranny of the cloud, these apps have to be able to communicate with others without servers, and that means peer-to-peer. I'm not just talking about web peer-to-peer like WebRTC. I'm talking about a native, fully capable peer-to-peer protocol. In 2023, Socket launched a stable peer-to-peer protocol that handles the incredibly hard problems of NAT traversal between peers without needing centralized stun and turn servers. A protocol where if two peers are online at the same time and have discovered each other, they can talk directly to each other. Nobody has to pay for a server to transmit that data. But a protocol that, unlike WebRTC, also works asynchronously and asymmetrically, meaning that two peers can communicate even if they're never online at the same time. The way this works is because Socket's peer-to-peer is a relay-based protocol, which means that we send your data encrypted, is by default relayed through other peers until it reaches its destination. Through a variety of techniques, including conflict-free replicated data types, apps communicating peer-to-peer like this can negotiate and collaborate with each other at arbitrarily large scale. Socket launched all of that way back in early 2023. And then later in 2023, somewhat after I gave that previous talk, Socket pushed the boundaries even further. They launched integrations with server-side generated frameworks where the generated static HTML just resides locally in the app. Again, no more servers. And then they launched native extensions where you could run language interpreters like Ruby, PHP, and Python, again, taking all that back-end code off of the server and just putting it directly in your apps. Along with peer-to-peer, this approach to putting the full stack of an app directly into the distributed on-device app completely revolutionized how we thought about, built, and experienced the web. Goodbye, servers. It did not take long before businesses got excited, by the way, and they started using Socket and others to build these same or better app experiences for their users, keeping all the necessary data and computation out on the peer-to-peer network. To date, tens of thousands of Socket-powered apps have been launched since those early days back in 2023. Most of these companies significantly reduced their cloud reliance. Some of them closed their cloud usage down entirely. Others left only the heaviest of data storage and compute activities out in the cloud, meaning their cloud bills were slashed by 75% or more. They report profits are skyrocketing along with their buildings, it seems. And users of these apps have been happier too. Apps that start instantly since they're already installed on their devices. Data is local first in these apps, so regardless of the internet, users can access their own data. Users easily keep all their own devices synchronized, either via the peer-to-peer network or more proximally through local Bluetooth. And when communicating or collaborating with others, data communication is usually almost instantaneous, since there's no costly round trips out to the cloud to worry about. There's a lot of amazing things going on in Local First right now. From its humble beginnings a bit before 2023 to just 4 short years later, it's really taken over the web. Arguably, it's now the default of the web to build local first, rather than the old way of building cloud first. I don't think it'll be much longer before we grow from reaching just 500 million users with local first experiences to billions. The cloud's days are numbered. Local first and peer-to-peer are where the future of the web is going to be built and experienced. There's still plenty to keep fixing, by the way, including the fight to keep our data private and the fight to keep centralized authorities from trying to wedge themselves back in between users and their own data. Back in 2023, the problems were many, and some of those solutions were just starting to emerge. But the hope for what the web could be, it was great. The bets that we started making back on Local First back then, they've really paid off today. In the now, a bit more than 30 years since the web was first commercialized and mainstream back in the early to mid-90s, it feels like we're really finally seeing the web realize its best and fullest potential. So as I wrap up my thoughts for you today, I want to share with you this quote. Most everyone has heard or read at least part of these famous opening lines from Dickens' timeless classic, A Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epic of belief, it was the epic of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on it being received for good or for evil in the superlative degree of comparison only. Dickens wrote these words in 1859 in a time of political turmoil, but they were about historical events 70 plus years earlier, another time of significant political and social upheaval. Most literary critics agree that the point that he was making was that the back then, the 1700s, just as the now, the 1800s, everyone likes to make bold assertions about how we're in the worst times that we've ever seen. But more importantly, in those same times, there are those with the vision and the hope for building a brighter tomorrow. In fact, the whole story of the web has been that same narrative. We've built amazing things, then become frustrated with the downsides of what we built, thrown it all away, become disillusioned, and then later laid out plans to rethink and work towards something better. So, just like Dickens, we can choose to accept the way the current web is, or we can choose to use it as the basis against what we hope for next. There really are two webs. The web that we see now with all of its good and its bad, and the web that we will have in the future. So back in 2023, I asked those of you in attendance to envision that future. What web did we want when we got back here in 2027? Would we, 4 years later, still be arguing about signals versus hooks or SSR versus SSG? Were we going to keep arguing about the ergonomics of the framework code or where our CSS sits? Or were we going to completely rethink deeper assumptions about how the structure of the web connects and communicates? Wasn't that a much more important topic to dig into? I'm so glad that we started to have those more profound conversations back then. Then, as now, whatever we choose to argue about and work on, we cannot merely complain about it being the worst of times. We also have the responsibility to start planning, to build for the coming web and its best of times. It truly is both the worst of times and the best of times for the web. And I think that's what makes it so exciting to be part of. Thank you very much for listening to my thoughts. Thank you very much, 2023, or CityJS 2027.